Hey, Mr. Lucas coming to you again, complete with my adult participation trophy. That's right, I just got done voting this morning, and so by the time you're watching this video, you probably already know who won the election, and I'm kind of jealous of you right now. I guess it's possible there's disputed election results, and maybe you don't know. Anyway, as you hopefully remember now, at this point in the class, we've been through the entire Constitution itself. In our last lesson, we went over the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the debates over the ratification of the Constitution. And we talked about how the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists compromised. The Anti-Federalists agreed to ratify the Constitution under the condition that the Federalists would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And that Bill of Rights is what we're going to start jumping into this week. That's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That begins with Amendment number 1. So let's start this lesson off with a little scenario brought to you via The Office. First question there, is what Dwight did legal? Hopefully most of you know that that is obviously not legal and you can get in big trouble for it. But why? Isn't shouting fire, whether it's true or not, a form of speech and expression, and isn't that protected by the First Amendment? Well, let's jump in and actually read the text of the First Amendment itself. The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. One thing I really want to emphasize here is that the First Amendment begins with the word Congress. Remember, the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment included in that restricts the federal government from abusing your rights. The states, well, if they wanted to, they could pass a law violating freedom of speech or establishing an official state religion if they wanted to. Well, at least they could up until maybe the last 100 years or so, when something called selective incorporation started applying the Bill of Rights to the state governments. That's something we'll talk about later. Now, there's a lot in that First Amendment. In fact, there's 5 freedoms that are protected from the government in that First Amendment, and sometimes it's hard to remember them all, sometimes even for a Supreme Court justice.
Are the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment?
Speech, religion, press, assembly, speech, press, religion, assembly. I don't know. What am I missing?
Redress or protest.
Okay.
But don't worry, there's an easy way to remember the 5 protections listed in the First Amendment. RASP, or you can remember it as Ralph and Sally Play Poker. RASP stands for religion, assembly, speech, press, and petition. If only Justice Barrett had my class for government. All right, so let's break it down and jump into the first one there. Religion. So that first part there is called the Establishment Clause, where it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But what the heck does that even mean? Well, remember good old King Henry VIII? That's who the Founding Fathers had in mind when they were writing this part of the First Amendment. Remember, King Henry VIII really wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, but the Catholic Church wouldn't let him. So he said, I'm going to break away from the Catholic Church and start my own church, and I'm going to name myself the head of it. That's exactly what he did. And he forced everyone in England to renounce their faith in Catholicism and to swear allegiance. They had to literally swear an oath of allegiance to the king as head of the new Anglican Church. And if they didn't, well, hopefully by now you know how that typically turned out. So yeah, back in the day, kings would establish an official religion that everyone had to follow. That means this Establishment Clause in the First Amendment really has the intention of preventing the federal government from creating a national religion that everyone is required to follow. But here's where people typically get a little bit confused. Let's say a member of Congress or even the president has very deeply held religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs influence their perception of the world, what they view as right and wrong. It might influence their perception of marriage or policies on abortion. If they allow then their religious affiliation to influence their policies, is that creating an establishment of religion? It's a complicated answer, but to sum it up best for you, the answer to that is no. The First Amendment's Establishment Clause means that religion is free from government influence, not that the government is free of religious influence. influence. Notice I said influence, not control. For a long time in European history, the Catholic Church in Rome controlled all of the governments in Europe. And if the kings ever implemented a policy that went against the doctrine of the Catholic Church, they would often be excommunicated, which means kicked out of the church, which was a bad thing. So when they wrote the Establishment Clause, they had two things in mind. Number one, that the church would not control the government, and then the government then in turn would not force all citizens to follow that one church or one religion. You've probably heard of the term before, separation of church and state, but that word separation, as you can see, is not actually in the First Amendment at all. The confusion over that has led some people to think that local governments putting, for example, a nativity scene around Christmas time on local government property violates the Establishment Clause. In the Supreme Court case Lynch versus Donnelly, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that a nativity scene on local government property does not violate the Establishment Clause. In that ruling, the Supreme Court actually even pointed to the fact that the first Congress that ratified the First Amendment and wrote the First Amendment also passed legislation that paid for chaplains or pastors to lead the House and Senate in prayer before each of their legislative sessions. So this is an example of the emphasis I just made. The First Amendment doesn't mean that government can't have any religious influence in it. That's why the Establishment Clause is linked to the Free Exercise Clause, which is that part of the First Amendment that says Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof. Again, this gets kind of tricky and it impacts what I as a teacher and what you as a student are allowed to do in schools when it comes to religion. Since schools receive taxpayer money and government money, they're kind of an extension of the government and are treated like the government. So as an extension of the government, the school can't force students to pray or participate in any acts of religion. As much as I love hymns, I can't force my classes to start singing Amazing Grace to me. Now, if you and another group of students want to get together and have a Bible study after school, or if you want to pray before lunch or as you come into the building during the day, as long as it doesn't disrupt the school day and the learning environment, you are perfectly free to do it. Now, I as a teacher can pray privately if I want to. The only difference is I can't lead the class in prayer, nor can I endorse one particular religion over the other. Yes, you, sir. I see you've got your hand up. You have a question? Yeah, Mr. Lucas, you said that as part of the government, you can't endorse a religion, but endorsing a religion is not the same thing as establishing a religion. And I don't see anything in the First Amendment that talks about endorsing a religion being prohibited. That's a great question. And it is true that the First Amendment doesn't say anything about government being prohibited from endorsing a religion. But over time, the Supreme Court has interpreted the Establishment Clause to also include prohibitions against endorsements of religion. In that case, Lynch versus Donnelly, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor proposed the endorsement test. And according to this test, a government action is invalid if it creates a perception in the mind of a reasonable observer that the government is either endorsing or disapproving of a religion. According to O'Connor's opinion, the Establishment Clause prohibits government from making adherence to a religion relevant in any way to a person standing in the political community. Government can run afoul of that prohibition by endorsement or disapproval of religion. Endorsement sends a message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the political community. So what you're saying, Mr. Lucas, is that the Supreme Court has now changed the meaning of the First Amendment through their interpretation to mean that endorsements of religion are also prohibited? But what about the Pledge of Allegiance? Doesn't it say one nation under God in there? So how is citing the pledge in school not technically an endorsement of religion in school? Well, that's because you have the option to sit out when your school does the Pledge of Allegiance. You don't technically have to participate in it. The school can't force you to cite the Pledge of Allegiance. So again, hopefully you realize that it's wrong when the government tries to force you to do something religious. And I agree, the whole endorsement thing is kind of confusing, and it's something the courts are still trying to figure out right now. I mean, is the government and schools allowing people to have Saturday and Sunday off during the week technically an endorsement of the religions that hold Saturday and Sundays as days of rest because they're the Sabbath? Where do you draw the line? Welcome to the world of law. All right, so a far less controversial aspect of the First Amendment is freedom of assembly. And that one's not too difficult to understand. The right to assemble means that people have the freedom to gather together to protest the government without the government punishing them and throwing them in prison for doing it. The only stipulation is that it has to be a peaceful assembly, meaning it's not a riot and you're not threatening or harming other people or their property. Simple enough. Let's move on to the big one. Speech. So freedom of speech means that the government can't arrest you and throw you in prison and punish you for speaking. And the courts have also determined that freedom of speech means more than just using your vocal cords to say words. It also includes other types of expression. In the same way that you can communicate using words, you can also communicate using expressions, whether that be things that you wear, paintings, drawings, written text, or even actions such as burning a flag. So does that mean you can say or do anything you want without any consequences? No. First of all, one of the biggest misconceptions students have when they learn about the First Amendment is they think that freedom of speech means that they can do or say anything they want anywhere and have no consequences whatsoever. Remember what I said earlier, the First Amendment protects you from the federal government abusing your rights. It doesn't protect you from mom or dad or your boss or social media website punishing you for your speech. Your parents, your boss, other companies can all punish you because they're private entities, meaning that they're not government. So the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. If you go into a church and start cussing, they have every right to kick you out. If you work in the food industry and you get a really difficult customer that's an absolute jerk to you and you start cussing them out, your boss has every right in the world to fire you if they want. So again, there's a difference between private entities punishing you for speech and government punishing you. The First Amendment prevents the federal government from punishing you for your speech or expression. Why was this restriction just given to government? It's because government can legitimately use violence against you. McDonald's can fire you for cussing out a customer, but they don't have an army of Ronald McDonald's that will hold a gun to your head and throw you into a cell for cussing out a customer. I'm just trying to imagine a secret police of Ronald McDonald's trying to arrest people.
Hi, we're here at McDonald's. We're about to initiate the investigation. I'm here with my detectives.
Yep. You need to stay hydrated, right? You want to have lunch or something? Is there like a place to eat around here? I think there's a lunch spot. Whoa, wait.
I can't get that out of my head. Okay, so obviously there can be consequences from private entities for expression you might make that's inappropriate. Yeah, you again, what do you want? Yeah, Mr. Lucas, you just said earlier that schools are an extension of the government if they receive government money. So why is it if I say a cuss word or something inappropriate, the school can suspend me or get me in trouble for it? Ooh, great question. Let's take a look at some Supreme Court cases that deal with freedom of speech in schools. One of the most famous cases is a case called Tinker versus Des Moines. This was a case involving two students who wore black armbands to school in order to protest the war in Vietnam. The school decided to punish them and suspend them for wearing the black armbands. They sued and said that they had a right to freedom of speech and that the suspension essentially was the government punishing them for that speech. Therefore, it violated the First Amendment. The school argued that wearing the armbands was disrupting the learning environment, meaning that it was making things tense because other kids who had relatives that were fighting in Vietnam were offended by the armbands, and it could cause a fight in the middle of the classroom. Therefore, the school had a perfectly justified interest in stopping them from wearing the armband. Both sides had a pretty good case, and the Supreme Court was tasked with trying to figure out if this was indeed a violation of the First Amendment or not. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the students, arguing that the school must provide evidence that there is a substantial threat of disruption by the students' actions. And they felt that in this case, there was no evidence that there would be a substantial threat to the learning environment. This became known as the Tinker test, and it's still used by the Supreme Court today in trying to decide free speech cases when it comes to schools. It all centers around the idea of the school needing to provide evidence that the students' actions can cause a significant disruption in the learning environment. This became a central component of the school speech doctrine. And whenever we talk about doctrine in regards to the Supreme Court, a doctrine simply means a list of criteria the court uses based off of previous court cases to determine how they're going to rule on a particular case. One of the next big updates to the school speech doctrine would come with a case called Morse versus Frederick in 2007. The story of this case actually goes back to the 2002 Winter Olympics. As many of you know, during the Olympics, there's a world torch relay where a torch basically goes around the world until it's finally lit to start the Olympic Games. It just so happened that the torch relay route went right by a high school in Alaska, and some students there came up with an idea. They knew all the world's cameras would be focused on them, so they decided to go to the property across from the school, and as the Olympic torch was going by and the whole world was watching, they would unveil a banner that said, "Bong hits for Jesus." Yeah. I'm sure that's the last time the Olympic torch route will go by an institution filled with people who have the maturity of a walnut. Now, naturally, the administration of the school was absolutely livid and suspended the students. But the students said, well, hold up. First of all, we have freedom of speech under the First Amendment. Second of all, it was on the property across from the school, so you can't suspend us. So what would the Supreme Court say about this one? In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court basically said that the right to freedom of speech does not extend to the promotion of illegal drug use, and that the school had every right in their power to try to stop the promotion of that. So that case, along with other cases, created the school speech doctrine we have today, which has 3 criteria. Number 1, is the student's speech substantially disruptive to the learning environment? Number 2, is the speech sexually vulgar or obscene? And number 3, is the speech, if allowed, as part of a school activity or function contrary to the educational mission of the school? So next time you're considering doing or saying something in school, consider those 3 criteria. Depending on what you do or say and how the school reacts, may or may not be protected by the First Amendment. Hopefully you're catching on now that with the First Amendment, there's a lot of gray areas. But that's exactly why we have the judicial branch, to help settle some of those disputes. Schools aren't the only place the government can restrict some types of speech. They can also restrict other types of speech outside of school too. When the United States entered World War I, there were some socialists who very much protested against the United States being involved in the war. They decided to start distributing little leaflets or pamphlets advocating for men not to register for the draft. Unfortunately for them, Congress and President Woodrow Wilson passed a law called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which punished anyone that criticized and spoke out against the government in a way that might hamper the war effort. As you can probably guess, once people were thrown in prison, they decided to sue the federal government and claim that their First Amendment rights to freedom of speech were being violated. But in a case called Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court sided with the federal government and said that the federal government was perfectly justified in restricting speech if that speech threatened national security. And they argued advocating for people not to register for the draft threatened the national security of the United States. Because if we didn't have people registering for the draft and didn't have an army, then Germany may have won. This was re-emphasized in a case called the United States versus O'Brien, where the Supreme Court sided with the federal government, who had arrested young men who were burning their draft cards so as to not fight in the Vietnam War. Now, besides potentially threatening national security, there are some other types of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment. For example, incitement is not protected by the First Amendment. Incitement means that you're trying to rile people up to commit violence or to break a particular law that might harm other people. It also means you can't do things to incite like a panic, meaning you can't yell fire in a crowded theater as a joke and then cause mass panic where everyone starts running over each other. So yeah, that's why what Dwight did was not protected by the First Amendment, inciting a panic. You also can't commit defamation, which is basically false statements or a lie that tries to hurt or damage someone's reputation. You often see defamation lawsuits between celebrities and publishing companies that might try to lie about them to damage the celebrity's reputation, maybe because they're mad at them or they're just trying to make a buck off of creating a news story that's clickbait. So basically, if you get together with your friends and you're talking and you say, you know what, I really hate Mr. Lucas. Why don't we do something where he gets fired and he can never get another job again? Let's make up a story. Let's say, I don't know, he kicks puppies and he stole money from a charity. And then you go to the newspaper and you tell them that and they publish that story, or you tell my bosses that and it's a complete lie, then I could sue you for defamation and I could win lots and lots of money. You, on the other hand, could possibly go to prison for damaging my reputation. And that's defamation. I always remember that pretty easily by thinking defamation ruins reputation. The next type of speech that's not protected by the First Amendment that I think probably most of you find pretty obvious are true threats. If you seriously threaten to harm someone or to kill someone, or you threaten to bring a bomb to school or something like that, then the government can legitimately throw you in prison for that. I always tell students, be very careful what you say, even if you're joking, because sometimes jokes can land you in hot water, especially if those around you don't get the joke or don't understand the context around the joke.
At a Kansas Home Depot, police responded to reports of a bomb threat at the store in Wichita. A customer alerted employees. A man inside the bathroom said there was a bomb in the building. Police were able to locate the man responsible for those comments, and that man told police he warned other guests to leave the restroom because he was, quote, fixing to blow it up, but had no intention of causing a panic. Man also told police others in the room laughed, understanding his joke, which I'm just now getting. Home Depot says they will not be pressing charges. To Ethan now, please.
No.
So thankfully, that guy was not arrested and there were no charges brought against him. But there are some jokes that are just not funny at all and are just not good ideas, period. Like this girl who thought it would be hilarious to tweet at Southwest Airlines and tell them she was a member of a terrorist organization and was going to do something very, very big, very, very soon. Obviously, Southwest Airlines reported her to the federal authorities and she was actually arrested. So even though there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to freedom of speech, there are some guiding principles that can help you figure out what's okay and what's not okay. Yes, you again. Yeah, okay, so I just want to get this straight. The armbands thing at the school was legal. The flag burning case we talked about a few weeks ago, Texas versus Johnson, it's perfectly legal to burn a U.S. flag, but burning your draft card is illegal, and the whole Bong Hits for Jesus sign thing was illegal. This is all a lot to keep up with, and it just kind of feels like the Supreme Court's making it up as they go. Well, it's true. The meaning of the First Amendment is constantly changing and evolving over time based off decisions that the court makes, which means that the membership of the Supreme Court is pretty important. Now, obviously in this class, we're not going to go through every Supreme Court case that deals with the First Amendment, but hopefully you can remember those three types of speech that generally speaking, the Supreme Court says are not protected by the First Amendment. Oh, wait, Mr. Lucas. Oh my gosh. Okay, last question from you, dude. But what about hate speech? Meaning like someone says something really racist or really mean to someone else and hurts their feelings or they insult them. That could incite violence or a fight. Heck, it might even cause someone to commit suicide. Doesn't government have an interest in protecting people and stopping that type of hateful speech and expression? We don't want Nazis and the KKK running around spreading a bunch of hate. I mean, imagine if Germany had a law against hate speech. They could have shut the Nazis up and they never would have gained a following. That's a great question. The Supreme Court has said hate speech is fine so long as it doesn't incite violence, so long as it's not defamation, and so long as it's not a true threat. Believe it or not, in the 1920s, Germany did have laws against hate crimes and against anti-Semitic, meaning anti-Jewish expression. The problem was when the Nazis took power, they changed those laws. And that's the danger with hate speech laws. Sometimes if a particular party takes control of the government, they might begin to change the definition of hate to include any political opposition to their rule. They might change that definition to include any criticism of themselves. They might alter that definition to give themselves the power to begin censoring opinions they don't want the rest of the country to hear. So while hate speech laws could potentially prevent the spread of hate, they also run the danger of giving the government the power to censor out opinions they don't want the rest of the public to hear. And that's exactly what Hitler and the Nazis began to do in Nazi Germany. They began to censor out opinions they didn't want the public to hear. And that's what censorship is. It's blocking out certain opinions from being heard or seen. Censorship allows the government to control the narrative and to control what people see and what they ultimately think. As we know, our founding fathers were very suspicious of government getting too much power. And that's precisely why George Washington said, if the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. And that's why the founding fathers not only wanted to prevent the government from censoring speech, but they also wanted to prevent them from censoring the press. Freedom of the press basically means that government cannot control the media. They cannot control what is printed in newspapers, books, or the internet, or what is broadcast on television or radio. We are allowed to get our information from any source. We can show our disagreement by speaking it, writing letters to newspaper editors, passing out leaflets, having our own web pages, etc. Now, there are some exceptions to that, just like with speech. For example, if a publishing company decides to publish top secret sensitive information that could threaten national security, then the government can come after them. The Federal Communications Commission also sometimes bleeps out cuss words when you watch television.
Sure, everyone, what's the procedure? Stay calm!
And that leads us to our last freedom protected in the First Amendment, the right to petition. To petition the government for a redress of grievances essentially means that we can ask the government for changes. We can do this by collecting signatures and sending them to our elected representatives, or by calling, writing, or emailing those representatives. In fact, the White House even has a link where you can sign a petition, and if the petition gets enough signatures, the White House will be forced to respond to it. Whew. And that is everything I could teach you about the First Amendment within a 30-minute video. So here's your assignments for this week. Obviously, you've got this Ed puzzle and one other Ed puzzle, which are both due on Wednesday. Then you have a Google form that's due on Thursday. And in this Google form, I throw out different scenarios at you to see if you can correctly identify whether or not that action is protected by the First Amendment or not. Feel free to use your resources to help you. And remember, this video is on my YouTube channel if you want to go back and rewatch some segments of it to try to get a refresher on some of that. Well, that'll do it for me this week. I think I'm going to go exercise my right to complain to the government about daylight savings time because it's 4 o'clock and I can't see my face in the camera anymore. Let me know if you need anything and have a great week.